Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Homeowner webinar series. We'll get started in a few minutes, but I just wanted to introduce myself. My name's Kaylee and I work for FFL. Go ahead and put in the chat what county you're from and what the biggest weed species problems that you have in your yard are. All right, it looks like we've got a lot of different things in the chat already. We've got some dollarweed, lots of dollarweed it looks like. We've got, someone said torpedo grass. So today we will be talking about homeowner herbicides and using them safely in your landscape. So we're very excited to hear from Dr. Chris Marble. We'll introduce him in a few minutes, but we'll just let more people get in the chat. Looks like someone said Biden's alba is a big weed species. It's very true. It is good for the pollinators. They do love it, but Biden's definitely gets all over the landscape very easily. So for those of you who are just logging on, go ahead and put what county you are from and if you have any problematic weed species in your yard. Looks like someone said weeds in their perennial peanut ground cover. So I have heard that is a problem. I think UF is doing some really interesting research and looking into new cultivars as well, just trying to prevent more weeds in perennial peanuts. So that will be really exciting to see in the future. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program Homeowner Webinar Series. This series is given every third Thursday of the month at 11 a.m. My name is Kaylee Graves, and I'm the Horticultural Science Specialist for the Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. Today we have Dr. Chris Marble, who will speak to us about understanding homeowner herbicides and using them safely in your landscapes. First things first, your microphones have been muted, but if you do have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A box of the chat instead of the chat. We will answer the questions at the end of the presentation. If you would, please stick around until the end and fill out the exit survey. That's very helpful for us because it allows us to see what type of programming you like, and it lets us know how we're doing. Our next webinar will be April 15th at 11 a.m. We will be joined by Dr. Nick Taylor, UF IFAS State Specialized Agent for the Program for Resource Efficient Communities, for a talk about the H2O SAVE program. Today, we'll be talking with Dr. Chris Marble. Dr. Marble is an associate professor in the Environmental Horticultural Department at the University of Florida's Mid-Florida Research and Education Center. He specializes in ornamental and landscape weed management, focusing on the biology and control of invasive plant species. His research aims to develop integrated weed management strategies that combine chemical and non-chemical methods to enhance efficacy and sustainability in ornamental crop production and landscapes. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today, and please take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you all for tuning in. Today we're going to be talking about homeowner herbicides and using them safely in the landscape. And what I'm going to try to do with this presentation is basically just kind of demystify and simplify a lot of the information out there on herbicides and then what herbicides that you have available to you. So the ones that I'm going to mostly talk about are the ones that you see most of the time in terms of the active ingredients in big box stores and things like that. But I'll talk about each of those, what those active ingredients actually do, and how to use those the most effective way in your landscape for weed management issues that you might have. So, well, go ahead and get started here. So just an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. So I'll first just cover, just in a few slides, chemical versus non-chemical weed control and kind of the advantages and disadvantages of each of those different broad groups or broad categories of weed control. And then look at cases when herbicides are most useful. And a lot of people think, herbicides or pesticides, you don't want to use those ever. There's definitely cases where it might call for those, and those might be the most practical method of control. And pesticides can be used if they're used responsibly as part of an integrated pest management program. And so that's what I talk about. And I talk about developing weed control programs where it's a combination of multiple different factors, focusing mostly on things like cultural controls that prevent the weeds from coming in and becoming a problem to begin with. But we'll talk about those when herbicides are most useful, and then get into kind of the meat of the presentation, which is the different herbicide options that you have available to you. And it can be kind of confusing. You look in the store and you have all these different options and all these different things that are weed killer, weed be gone, a grass killer, et cetera, et cetera. But how many different herbicides really are there? And so we'll talk about those and the active ingredients, and really what you're choosing from is a combination of just a handful of different herbicides that are marketed differently. And then knowing what you're using and what you're using it for. Go over some of the trade names and marketing confusion, and then some of the tips for the best results in using these herbicides in the most effective manner. So just to start off, so why is weed control important? Of course, in agriculture production, it's very simple and straightforward. You've got to increase crop yields because weeds are highly competitive with especially agricultural crops. But we also have to control weeds and invasive plants to do things like protect natural resources, protect wildlife and their habitat, and then also save native species. One of the big threats to native plant species and native other things besides plants too is just the invasive species coming in and out competing those, because when plants are taken out of their native range and they're put somewhere where they can be invasive, they don't have any natural enemies there, and so they can outcompete some of those native plants. So those are big, ecological, environmental reasons why you would want to control weeds and invasive plants. And then in the landscape, we don't really think about those as much. We're managing weeds mostly for aesthetics. We might have to manage weeds for safety because some weeds can be toxic. You also have invasive plants that can be harmful. Property values. Some of you might be dealing with local ordinances or HOA, rules and things where you have to manage weeds to not get fined by the HOA or get a nasty letter in the mail and things like that. So there's all kinds of different reasons why you might have to manage weeds. But all in general, it allows us to use plants for our benefit and to benefit others is the main thing. So just to go over some non-chemical advantages and disadvantages. When we're talking about non-chemical weed control, this presentation is mostly on chemical weed control. But just to put that out there, and that, when you're looking at managing weeds, you always need to consider those non-chemical methods, because sometimes they can be the most effective method. And then in a lot of cases, we might not have labeled herbicide options. So in some cases, there's just nothing that we can do. People will ask me all the time, I have this vine growing up in between my rose bushes and things. What can I spray on to kill it? There's probably not going to be anything selective that you can do, without harming the rose or whatever ornamental it is that you have growing there. And so a non-chemical method is going to be the most useful in that case. With herbicides, there's more training and more practice, and you have to be a little bit more precise than you do with these non-chemical methods. Less risk of causing environmental issues if they're used incorrectly. Can be very environmentally friendly to the non-chemical methods. Also with herbicides, and I'll get into this, but you're going to have to know how to calibrate and to use the different application equipment. But with non-chemical methods, there's no math involved, so you don't have to worry about that. I mean, it can be therapeutic in some cases. You get the professor that I used to work for at Auburn, he would go out into his garden all the time and he would hoe weeds in between his rows of corn and tomatoes and everything. And he would he would name each of the weeds one of the administrators that was causing him problems, and he would go through and clean them up. And he said it was therapeutic that way. Um, I always thought that was funny. But it can be a standalone method. And with herbicides, you don't want herbicides to be the only method that you're using to control weeds. You want to incorporate other things, but non-chemical that can stand kind of its own in some cases. The cons, though, why you would want to select herbicides. Non-chemical methods are going to be a lot more time consuming and more costly, especially if you're paying someone to do it. But if you're not, if you're doing it yourself, it's more costly in terms of time. Um, Also might not be as effective, especially for perennials or invasive plants. It's like one of those things where torpedo grass was one of the questions or one of the weeds that was mentioned. You have torpedo grass bed and plant beds. Really, the only way to get rid of that non-chemically is to go in and dig, several feet of soil out and remove that to get all of the biomass out because it's going to regenerate. Um, with organic herbicides, that's definitely if somebody's just against synthetic herbicides, there's organic herbicides that are available, but you typically do need to have higher doses and need to use them more just because they're not going to be as effective on especially certain weeds. Um, and then a lot of things aren't really natural. People that are against synthetic herbicides and things, but they might use things like bleach for as a herbicide. You know, uh, don't use anything that's not labeled and intended to be used as a herbicide because you're not going to know the right dosage and all those different things. Anyways, even if herbicides are used, non-chemical methods should still be part of an integrated weed management program because that all goes back to that integrated pest management where we're using multiple different methods to get the best results, both in terms of plant health and eliminating or reducing the population of pests, which weeds are a pest that we often deal with. So when are herbicides most useful? When you have widespread weed issues, it's going to be very difficult to get on top of that using non-chemical methods. And so herbicides are typically going to be at least the most practical way to do that. Or if you had dangerous or harmful weeds, like I have an example here, stinging nettle, you have that all in a lawn and it's covering up a big area. You might not be able to remove that all by hand, and you had children playing and things, and that can cause a lot of problems. So herbicides might be the best way to control or prevent that. Pre-emergence herbicide, something like that. Invasive plants, they can continue to spread if they're not controlled. Difficult to remove invasives or weed species where it's just difficult to remove them physically. And then also, you might need to have herbicides to allow the establishment of desired plants. Um, and I always say, keep this in mind when you're talking about weeds. People will oftentimes they'll show me pictures of weeds and say, this such and such weed is killing my grass and it's just completely taken over. It probably didn't kill the grass. So I always think of weeds, and this isn't always the case, but 9 times out of 10, weeds are going to be secondary invaders. They come in when that turf or the plants or there's some other problem. We're watering too much, we're over fertilizing, it's too shady for what we're trying to grow there, et cetera, because no matter what kind of environment we create in the landscape, there's going to be a weed species that's going to be able to thrive in that environment, whereas the plants that we're trying to grow might not thrive in that environment. So look at what's happening culturally at the site and why that particular weed is there. What is that weed's tendency? Is it like wet areas? Do I have dollarweed because I'm potentially overwatering, or it's just a low-lying area that isn't draining properly, or do I have goosegrass everywhere because it's a highly compacted area? Things like that. So just always think of those cultural things. Why are the species there that I'm dealing with, and why is the grass weaker than it should be? Now we're going to get into some of the herbicides. So of course, with chemical controls, with herbicides, there's 3 things that determine the type of herbicide that you're dealing with. It's timing, translocation, and target. That's an easy way to kind of think of it. Timing, herbicides can be classified by timing, and that's pre or post emergence, and that's fairly self-explanatory. Pre-emergence, you're applying those to kill the weeds as they germinate from seed. Post-emergence are the weeds that are already there, and that's what people typically focus on, are the weeds that they can see. And then translocation. So is the herbicide systemic or is it contact? I'll talk about those a little bit more later, but just so that we're all on the same page when I'm using some of these terms throughout this presentation, a herbicide that is systemic or translocated means that it contacts the plant and it's going to move, whether to the roots or from the roots up or from the foliage down. And it's going to move in the plant and likely give you total control of that plant, or at least move in that plant. A contact is only going to contact or affect the part of the plant that spray actually contacts. So an example of this will be something like diquat, for example. That's strictly contact. So if diquat, a little drop lands onto a leaf, that leaf might burn off, but the rest of the plant will be completely unaffected. Whereas glyphosate, which is systemic, a little bit of glyphosate lands on a leaf, and that has a high probability of moving throughout that entire plant. And then the last thing is target. So what are you actually targeting? Selective, meaning that herbicide only affects certain types of plants, or non-selective, where it kills everything that's green, or at least has activity on most things. So those are the terms that I'll be using throughout this presentation as I talk about the different classifications of herbicides. So you go to the store and you're looking at the different herbicide aisles, and you probably see a lot of products that look like this: weed and grass killer, herbicide granules, weed killer, everything's weed killer, weed be gone, et cetera, et cetera. And weed stop. You look at all these different things and you think, what do I actually need? So you try to, you're looking at it, which one of these is actually the best option. You might have tons of these different things out there to actually choose from, but really you only have a few different things. A lot of these herbicides, especially the ones that are marketed heavily towards homeowners, are just a few different active ingredients that are put together in different ways, or they're used at different rates and things, depending upon what they're being used for. So there's not a whole lot of a difference in between the different options that are out there. This is just an anecdotal example, so this isn't a replicated, repeated trial or anything, but recently I had to go get some supplies for a project, and then I was doing stuff for home, and I was redoing irrigation, at my house, and so I was going to a bunch of different big box places to get parts, and I was like, well, I'll just stroll through the different aisles and see what all they have in the herbicide section to see what's available. And so I actually started writing this down. This is just kind of a back of an envelope calculation. So 5 different big box retailer locations in Central Florida. I counted 76 different herbicide products. So that's just different things that are labeled as weed killers or weed preventers, 76 different ones. But then if you look at the different active ingredients in all those, there was just 7 different active ingredients used in different combinations. So there was 2,4-D, dicamba, glyphosate, glufosinate, pendimethalin, atrazine, and diquat. Those were the only active ingredients that I actually found in those 76 different herbicide products. So this is just, over the span of a 2-week span. So there's definitely more things available than that, but that just gives you an example of the few number of active ingredients that you're actually dealing with. And I say that to kind of give you encouragement that, with just using something like this presentation or my ES article on homeowner herbicides, you can become very familiar and knowledgeable on the different active ingredients that are out there. The names look weird and they can be hard to pronounce and things like that, but you don't even have to pronounce them. You just need to know what they are and what they do. Knowing the different active ingredients is going to help you a lot when you're using herbicides. Because then you can figure out, is the product that you're buying, is it different from what you bought last year or last time that didn't work, or is the package just different? You used Weed Stop last year, you had poor results. And so this year you got Weed Be Gone, thinking hopefully that you'll get better results. Is it really different, or is it the same, 3 or 4 different active ingredients put together that are just packaged differently? So that can help you once you know a little bit about those different active ingredients and what they're actually doing. So if you're going to use pesticides, herbicides is a type of pesticide, know your different active ingredients. And I say, people will say, I used the Weed Be Gone and it didn't control my target weed species, whatever that is at the time. And I say, Weed Be Gone is not a herbicide. That's not even a trade name, really. It's just kind of a brand name. But it's not a herbicide. So what is the actual active ingredient? It's on the first page of all those different labels. But trying to learn and begin to become familiar with what those active ingredients actually do. And so quick Google searches, you can find this information pretty easily. And all those labels are available online also. And also you need to know your turf grass, especially if you have St. Augustine, or if you're one of these situations where you might have a couple different varieties of grass that are kind of mixed together. I'm an example of that. At the house that I live at now, I didn't do this, but most of the lawn is St. Augustine, but I do have a section of zoysia that was put there for whatever reason. So if you have areas like that, you need to be able to manage it to where all the different turf types that you have that are desirable to you are safe from the herbicide that you're actually using. Um, and then also, the different St. Augustine grass varieties. If it was put in fairly recently, you probably know, or what kind of sod that you bought, but some labels will say, only for use on certain cultivars of St. Augustine, or certain varieties of St. Augustine, or not for use on Floratam, et cetera, et cetera. So for some of those herbicides, you need to know, the different varieties that you actually have, because that can be important in terms of turf safety. So know your herbicides. Knowing the brand name or trade name, it doesn't really tell you anything because that changes. And then know what active ingredients that you're using. And so this is an example. So these are all 4 different things that are basically marketed as Roundup, but then it's different types of Roundup. And Roundup doesn't even really mean glyphosate anymore. In the homeowner segment, they took glyphosate out of what they call Roundup, but Roundup is just kind of a, it's a name that everybody is familiar with, good or bad. That name's been out there for a long time, but it's Roundup. For example, this is Roundup Max Control 365, Roundup Quick Pro, Roundup for Lawns, Roundup Landscape Weed Preventer. These are all wildly different herbicides that do wildly different things. But you can't just say, I used Roundup, for example. But the trade names change, active ingredients can change, formulations and mixtures can change. And so even if you've used that same product over and over for several years, when you get it, for the actual product that you have, read that label and become familiar with it, because there can be major changes and they don't actually have to advertise that. All that information will be included on the label, but you might have bought, herbicide ABC every year for 5 years, and then you go to get it one year and that formulation changes, the active ingredient changed, and you could get very different results. This is an example of that. So this was a fairly big news story. I guess it was about 10 years ago now, but Bonus S Weed and Feed. Scott's product, and it's been around for a long time, and it's a real popular product. But historically, the Scott's Bonus S Weed and Feed, the herbicide component in that was atrazine. But then about 10 years ago, they switched it out and they made that active ingredient metsulfuron. And so the people that had always gone out and bought Turf Builder Bonus S Weed and Feed, when they went and bought it, if they had read that label, they would know that it's not for use on certain turf grass types that it could cause damage to. So in this case, a lot of places in Mississippi and South Carolina and other places had a lot of injury on things like carpet grass, for example, because that label wasn't read. The company actually paid out a lot of money to replace those lawns that were damaged. but that was because of an active ingredient change that people just weren't familiar with, and they didn't look to see the active ingredient there. So now we'll get into some of these actual herbicides, and I'm going to kind of go through these just so that you're familiar with the different active ingredients. So when you see those, you have at least a reference point, and you can say, okay, so this herbicide has 4 different components to it. What are they actually for, and what am I actually targeting with those different active ingredients? So number one, 2,4-D combinations, and these are by far probably the most common different herbicides that you have, especially when you're talking about weed control and turf grass. So you'll have 2,4-D, and that'll typically be combined with dicamba. And both of those are broadleaf active herbicides. They don't have really any activity on grasses or sedges for the most part. But those are often combined, and those two, you'll often see those together because it broadens the spectrum of control. So 2,4-D, you get a certain number of weeds, and with dicamba, you get a certain number of weeds. There's a lot of overlap there, but they work well together, and you can control a larger number of broadleaf weeds. So those are often combined. Carfentrazone might also be in there, and that's another broadleaf component. You might also see things like MCPP, MCPA, those are all broadleaf weed components that you see in different 2,4-D combinations. But they won't control all broadleaf weeds. So just because you have a broadleaf component doesn't mean that every broadleaf weed is going to be targeted. You actually have to look a little bit further and see if the weed species that you're looking at is on the label, or a lot of times these labels aren't going to include all the weeds that they're actually effective on, because that could be, hundreds or thousands of different weed species. What I suggest doing, yes, look at the label, but then also look at efficacy charts and things that are online. IFAS articles are a great resource for that. We have a great turf weed specialist at Florida, Powell Patelowitz, and he has a lot of great IFAS articles on weed control, as did the previous weed specialist we had, Ramon Leon, who had a lot of good turf information. But looking at those things in those efficacy charts and saying, okay, so if I use 2,4-D, it's actually good on these weed species. But with those 2,4-D combinations, some of those can damage St. Augustine grass varieties. They're typically safe, though, depending on what those other components are on your Bermuda grass, your zoysia grass, Bahia, etc. Clinchlorac, you might see that, and depending upon what turf species it's actually labeled in, you might see that added into some of those for crabgrass control. But that's Clinchlorac. That's not that common in at least the homeowner market, at least from my experience. Another broadleaf weed control product that you see a lot is atrazine, and that's kind of the standard for things that they'll market it as safe for St. Augustine grass, and it's atrazine. And with atrazine, what you're doing, you have pre and post-emergence control with it. People are typically using it mostly as a post-emergence product, but you're targeting broadleaf weeds. The thing to look out for, though, is those temperature requirements, because if you use that during the hot time of the year, that's when you can run into issues. And typically those labels will say, do not use above 85 or 90 degrees, because you can run into injury concerns to the turf grass. But those are probably some of the most common broadleaf weed control products that you'll see, at least for on the turf grass side. Then you get into non-selective herbicides, and these things might be just labeled as things like weed and grass killers, or all vegetation control, or something like that. Glyphosate, that was the one that was the most common. You can still get it in some cases at big box places, but it's being phased out of the homeowner products. It's a systemic and it's non-selective, so it has activity on all weeds that aren't resistant or that it controls, but most people are familiar with glyphosate. Diquat, you see that also. You might see these things in things like Quick Pro, or something that promises fast results or visible results in less than 1 hour, and that's in big font on the first page of the label. And that's because with these contact products that work very quickly, They don't move in the plant, so you know, you're not getting movement to the roots of that weed, but they work very fast. And so some people really like that. They're non-selective, so anything that's sprayed with something like diquat is going to burn typically. But that's added to a lot of products, even like glyphosate products, but it's to give speed so that people can spray it, and then 2 hours later they can tell that they made an application. Pelargonic acid is very similar. It's a contact, non-selective, and it works very quickly. Diquat and pelargonic acid are often combined with those other things to speed up results, basically. Glufosinate is one, and I've seen that probably more common since there's been a lot of glyphosate controversy and things. But it's a non-selective. You get some minor translocation, but it's primarily considered a contact herbicide. It doesn't work near as fast as something like diquat or pelargonic acid. You might control some weeds a little bit better with it, but it's faster than glyphosate. Glyphosate, you know, you might not see results for a week, depending upon the weed species and the weather conditions. But with glufosinate, you can see results within 3 to 4 days typically. But it's another one that it controls basically. It's non-selective, has activity on broadleaf grasses and sedges. You might also see things marketed as brush control or vine killers and things, or poison ivy killers. So you see these a lot, and typically the main thing that they have that these typically have is triclopyr. So that's another broadleaf active herbicide. It can also be maybe combined with glyphosate for some of these brush control or vine killers, etc. Triclopyr is a little bit more active herbicide, and it's translocated. It has activity on broadleaf weeds, so it's something that's going to be effective on something like poison ivy. But you can use it, and it can control some weeds and invasive plants and things better than something like a 2,4-D, for example. So they might use triclopyr as the broadleaf component for a vine killer. Triclopyr is also not going to be something that's going to be not for use on most residential turf, and definitely not if it's labeled as a brush control or vine product that you could use in turf grass. You also wouldn't really want to use these in planting beds because triclopyr, you know, this would be something for like vines growing on a fence or something like that. You wouldn't want to use them to spot treat, you know, small weeds around planting beds and things, but look at those labels and see those restrictions. We already talked about 2,4-D. That's a very common broadleaf herbicide, but you might also see that as a component or one of the active ingredients in brush control or vine killers and things like that. But these are the three ones that you see most commonly as the active ingredients in those products. And so glyphosate combination. So there's a bunch of these. I already talked about diquat and pelargonic acid, and you see those added to them. Like for example, Roundup Quick Pro. You see this, and that's just basically glyphosate plus something like diquat or pelargonic acid, depending upon the product. I've seen both of those, but they add those in at a very small rate. So that you get that burn down, that quick control, so someone knows that they sprayed and they say, oh, it works very effectively. Really, what's really killing the weed is the glyphosate component to that. The diquat or the pelargonic acid is just there to burn the plant, you know, very quickly. If it's a small weed, they work on their own, but typically you need glyphosate if the weed's larger or if it's a perennial weed. This is where to really pay attention to. And this is where I see the most problems with homeowner herbicides is with these two active ingredients, imazapyr and imazethapyr. So these are systemic, non-selective, and they could be considered kind of soil sterilant herbicides. So no herbicide is inherently bad. You know, their herbicides are tools. Tools can do, you know, they can hurt people or they can be used to build you know, beautiful buildings and things like that. It just depends on how they're used. So two products that you'll see are things that are similar. Ground clear, you know, vegetation killer, Roundup 365, etc. These are typically something like glyphosate as the main component. Then they include imazethapyr or imazapyr in there. Those are ALS inhibiting herbicides. That's just the mode of action of those. But those are long-lasting root absorbable herbicides. And so they put those two active ingredients, or those are the two most common ones that I see, in there to be able to say that it provides 365 weed control, year-long weed control, where it controls weeds up to 8-9 months or whatever they're going to say, up to 1 year. In Florida, you usually don't see that anyways, but it does give you longer term control than just using glyphosate alone, which has no pre-emergence activity, whatsoever. But there's a caveat to those, and that you don't want to use these anywhere close around ornamental plants or any kind of desirable plant species, and that includes the root zone, because both of those herbicides are highly root absorbable. They're great, options for invasive plant management and things when they're used accordingly. Those are different labels and things, but these homeowner products, I say people use these in planting beds all the time, and it'll permanently disfigure a lot of different plants. So these are things that you would use in walkways, driveways, patio pavers, stuff like that, nowhere in a planting bed. Another thing that you might see in glyphosate combinations is something like indaziflam. That's a pre-emergence herbicide. It does not have the same, activity or things that imazapyr or mazethapyr do. It's not going to be absorbed by plant roots. It's just a regular pre-emergence herbicide. But the labels will give directions on all these things and how to use them effectively. But those are just two different actives to really look out for. Make sure that you're using those correctly, because Roundup 365, that's much different than Roundup Quick Pro, for example. They're used in many different or vastly different ways. This is just some examples of ALS damage on ornamentals, and this is the result of those homeowner products, and basically spot treating weeds or making large applications around the base of those plants. The plant itself doesn't have to be contacted because those herbicides, at least over time and after a few applications, or even one application in some cases, depending upon the rate that was used, those plants can absorb those herbicides through the roots, those ALS inhibiting herbicides. So, and you get this kind of witches brooming, cupping of the foliage, distorted growth, etc. And that's pretty typical for ALS herbicide damage. So not saying that those are inherently bad herbicides, but they're often used incorrectly. This would be, an application for that. Hardscapes, things like that, where there's no plant roots anywhere close by. This could be an example where it was used on this walkway. You wouldn't even want to use it really in this gravel where you're growing plants, but on this walkway, those could be potentially used in something like that, not in planting beds or around trees and things like that. Another Roundup combination is the Roundup for lawns. So this has no glyphosate actually in it. You have 4 different active ingredients in this product. You have pinoxalam, which that's one we haven't really talked about, but that's a broadleaf herbicide, real common in rice production and several other cropping systems and things, but it can be used on certain turf grass species. But it's a broadleaf herbicide, and they add that in there because you've got 2,4-D and dicamba, which are 2 other active ingredients, and those will control a lot of broadleaf weeds. But pinoxalam is there for broadleaf weeds, but it would have at least better control of things like potentially dollarweed, Florida betony, some clovers and stuff. Then also you have sulfentrazone, which is added to this herbicide, and that's for sedges. So I'm not just using this herbicide to talk specifically about this particular product, but just to kind of show you how they're putting different active ingredients together in a product so that you can use that, on turf grass, and it controls a spectrum of weeds. But to control that spectrum of weeds, it's not one active ingredient, or it's not, they could change Roundup for lawns tomorrow and it has different active ingredients and it's used on different turf grass species, for example. But this is the way that they kind of do it, where they put different active ingredients together to solve problems and to control a broad range of weed species. The new Roundup that you see, it does not have glyphosate in it. It'll say, you know, something like exclusive formula or something like that, but no glyphosate in it. It has these three different active ingredients. So the new Roundup is triclopyr. We've talked about that for broadleaf weeds. That's one that I told you might be in those vine or brush killers, etc. You also have a herbicide called fluazafop. That's a graminicide. That means that it only has activity on grasses. So you've got broadleaves and grasses covered there. These are both systemic, so fairly large broadleaf weeds and large grasses, perennial grasses, etc. They would control those. You couldn't use this on lawns just like you couldn't regular Roundup. But then it also has diquat added to it, and that's what you would add, what they're adding in basically for quickness. So you have very fast results with the diquat, contact non-selective. The one difference with the new Roundup versus the old Roundup, glyphosate has activity on sedges. You don't really have a sedge component in this new product. The diquat will have activity on sedges, but you just don't get the systemic action. Also, just looking at the labels, you have a longer plant back restriction. So, you know, with the old Roundup, you could spray and then you could plant into that area pretty soon after it was treated. This, you have up to 30 days, in some cases longer. So you can't just use the Roundup like you used the old Roundup. That's just to illustrate the importance of looking at those labels and how those change depending upon what active ingredients are actually being used in those products. There's a lot of contact products out there that people can purchase, and these are basically just fast burn down, control very small weeds and annual weeds pretty well with these. Here's just some examples. You know, you might have fatty acid soaps, diquat we've talked about, glufosinate we've talked about, organic labeled products that are, you know, labeled as natural or organic weed killers. You might have things like concentrated citrus oil, oregano oil, acetic acid, which is basically like horticultural vinegar, things like that. And those are, they can be labeled as organic, and they're just fast burn down, strictly contact. They're going to burn anything that they touch, but they're not going to translocate in the weed, basically. The homeowner concoctions that you see, baking soda, soap, vinegar, all that stuff, etc. Those are all contact. So they're not going to move in the plant. They're going to burn anything that they touch, basically. Other post herbicides that you might see, and I'll just go over these relatively quickly so that we have time at the end for questions. You might see bentazone, so that could be labeled as or marketed as something like a sedge killer. I've seen image nut sedge killer, and it's the active ingredient is bentazone, and that's basically for nut sedge, yellow and purple nut sedge, mostly yellow nut sedge. But you can control some broadleaf weeds with that, but those products are mostly for sedge control. They can be used in turf grass. You might also see halosulfuron added as a component of different things, and that's for basically all sedges to control sedges in turf grass or just in planting beds, depending upon the product. Imazaquin is another sedge product. That one's not very common in the homeowner segment, but you might have it. They used to sell it as Image, but that name changes. The commercial product was Image, and now it's Scepter. But you still might see imazaquin as sold as a sedge killer. And then phenoxaprop and fluazafop. So that's a mouthful, but both of those are similar to that. I already talked about fluazafop before, but they're just for grasses. So you might see something labeled as a grass killer. That could be, when it says grass killer, that can mean that it's non-selective, and they call it a grass killer because it will kill your turf grass if you spray it there, or it might actually be just a grass killer. And so they put that in there because it controls just grasses. So phenoxaprop and fluazafop are just graminicides. They just have activity on grasses. They don't control broadleaf weeds or sedges, but they might be sold as grass killers. And then we already talked about sulfentrazone a little bit, but that's another one that you might see like in the Roundup for lawns, for example, and that's added to control sedges, and that's often combined with broadleaf herbicides for turf products because it's labeled for use on sulfentrazone can be used safely on a lot of different turf grass species. And then you have pre-emergence herbicides also. And I know I'm going through a lot of these different herbicides and things. Anybody that wants this presentation, I'd be happy to give it. And all this information is also in my EDIS article on homeowner herbicides too, where you can reference all this. But dithiopure, so that's a pre-emergent herbicide that you'll see as a weed preventer. Prodiamine, Arazoline, Trifluralin. These are all just pre-emergence herbicides. With all the options you have on this screen here, they're going to work pretty well on grasses. They'll control some broadleaf weeds, but then the weeds that aren't spreading from seed, they're not really going to have that much activity on. Dithiopure, prodiamine, and you don't see Arazoline as much, but those are all for grasses and some broadleaf weeds. Trifluralin, you might see that sold as preen, like preen weed preventer and things. It's a very safe herbicide in terms of safety to ornamentals. So it might be something that's labeled for use in and around planting beds and things, but it doesn't last as long as some of the other pre-emergence herbicides. So that's a downside to it, but people can get good results with it. But those are all for grasses and broadleaf weeds that are coming and spreading from seed. Here's some other ones coming from seed. Isoxaben, that's for broadleaf weeds, uncommon in the homeowner segment, but you might see it. Indaziflam, that's a broader spectrum pre-emergence herbicide, but still broadleaf weeds and grasses. Pendimethalin, that's another pre-emergence herbicide for broadleaf weeds and grasses. You might see Roundup crabgrass preventer, and the active ingredient, at least on the products that I've seen, are pendimethalin. And that's just, it controls, grasses really well from seed. Atrazine, that can be considered a pre-emergence herbicide, but it's typically used post-emergence, but it does have some pre-emergence activity. Any of these that I've talked about too, these pre-emergence herbicides, they might be added as components in weed and feed products, which there's some issues with the weed and feed products that I'm not going to get into a lot in this presentation. I'll share one slide on that, but you might see those as components of different weed and feeds or weed preventers, et cetera. You'll see some of these active ingredients listed. Just to kind of end this up, so there's major differences in efficacy with these. Just because I called something a broadleaf herbicide doesn't mean that it's going to control all broadleaf weeds, or that it's a pre-emergence herbicide that is going to stop all weeds from emerging. Just because it's a pre-emergence herbicide does not mean that it controls all weeds. Example, of all the pre-emergence herbicides that I mentioned, and I mentioned about 10 of them, indaziflam would be the only one that will be, consistently effective on something like doveweed. So doveweed's a weed that's very hard to control pre-emergence. Somebody might go out with Roundup weed preventer and think it's going to work on all their weeds and prevent all weeds from coming up, and that's just not the case. If you're targeting, a specific weed, make sure that you're choosing a herbicide that's going to have activity on that weed. The weed preventer is not going to prevent all weeds. It's going to prevent the weeds that herbicide is actually effective on. And then I already talked about this, but broadleaf herbicides does not mean it's going to kill all broadleaf weeds. Look at those efficacy charts and those labels to figure out what weed it's actually going to control. There's a lot of this information. This is just an example. This is the 2017 Southeast U.S. Pest Control Guide. This is for nursery crops and landscape plantings. But there's, a lot of different places and universities and things have charts like this where you have all these different weed species and then all these herbicides or whatever, you're targeting. And then efficacy rankings, whether it's good, poor, fair, etc. So you can use information like this and then also combined with label information to figure out what the best herbicide is for your specific situation, or if an effective herbicide even exists. Just another thing, major differences in efficacy. Atrazine, active on broadleaf weeds, but oxalis is an example where it's not the most effective option on it. Glyphosate, it's a non-selective and it's supposed to kill all weeds, but artillery weed, for example, it doesn't have really any activity on artillery weeds. So know those herbicides and look up that information. If you're targeting a weed, you have a #1 weed species like you mentioned in the chat. Make sure that when you're targeting it, that the herbicide that you're using is actually effective on that. Can be some major differences in safety also. So this is just an example. Metsulfuron is considered a broadleaf herbicide, but it could kill a Bahia grass lawn, especially if it was used at a high rate, but it could definitely damage it. It's a broadleaf herbicide, but it can injure turf grass or grass species. It will kill certain grass species. So that's just some of the intricacies with some of these, and just as a word of caution. So which type of herbicide is needed? Pre-emergent herbicides, you're mostly looking at controlling annual broadleaf and grass weeds from seed. It's not going to work on those weeds spreading vegetatively. So something like dollarweed, torpedo grass, Florida betony, nut sedge is another one. Your pre-emergent herbicides aren't going to really be effective on those because the primary way that they're spreading is through vegetative means, whether that's tubers, rhizomes, stolons, etc. They're not spreading from seed. They can spread from seed, but they're mostly spreading vegetatively. So pre-emergent herbicides aren't going to be the most effective option on those. Spurge, crabgrass, stuff like that. Yeah, pre-emergent herbicides would be a good option. Post-emergence, most of you are dealing with selective options, especially in turf, but you've got to choose based upon the target weed. And then again, look up the efficacy information, whether it's on the label, university resources, manufacturer resources. So the companies that actually make these have good resources also. And for them to put a weed on the label, they have to have data to back that up. They're not just pulling that out of thin air. They have to have data that they're presenting to the EPA and things to put that information on the label. Will pre-emergent herbicides work? Already talked about this, but looking up that weed and actually how it's spreading, that's going to tell you dollarweed, nut sedge, pre-emergent herbicides. There's some that will have activity on those for sure, but most of your pre-emergent herbicides that are available to the homeowner segment aren't going to be effective on those, but things like spurge, oxalis, goosegrass, etc. Yeah, pre-emergent herbicides will work. Calibration is key with herbicides. And as I'm kind of running out of time, I'm not going to go over a lot of this, but just make sure that you're putting the right rate out. And this is an easy way to do it, is just know your square footage and how much product that you actually need to apply to that area, and then weigh that out in your spreader or whatever you're using, and then put it on a low setting, and then make a lot of different passes. And so you're getting the correct amount of product out, as opposed to putting that setting on a really high, and then you make 2 passes and all your product's gone, and you're like, oh no, I just applied a 10x rate, to basically a thin strip of the lawn. The settings recs and the labels are good, and that's a good starting point, but they're not foolproof, and so you still have to make your passes at the right rate and everything. But putting it on a very low setting and making a lot of passes is kind of a easier way to do that once you can calculate how much product that you need for your planting bed or turf grass or whatever it is. A lot of ornamentals that can compete with weeds. This is just a small list, but if you have big weed issues and things like fogfruit, dichondra, junipers, ornamental grasses, etc., those can compete pretty effectively with a lot of the weeds that we're battling. Problems to look out for, small differences in trade names. Dismissed turf herbicide, this is just sulfentrazone, can be used around ornamentals. Dismissed south, that has a mazethapure in it. That's just one different component of that, and then it's just dismissed south. We're in the south. Shouldn't we be able to use that on our turf grass? You can, but it's Bermuda grass and things like that, not St. Augustine, or definitely not ornamental planting beds. So look closely at those labels and make sure you're buying what you're intending to buy. Another thing to look out for is with those herbicides that are root absorbed, those ones that are used on turf grass. This is an example, metsulfuron. So it's a good herbicide, and I've recommended people to use it a lot, but when people use it routinely in turf grass and things, it can be absorbed from plant roots, especially if it's not applied at the right rate. And it can be absorbed from the roots of trees and cause injury to those. So that's another issue with weed and feeds. So with weed and feeds, people are often concerned about the timing between the herbicides and the fertilization, but also with weed and feeds, for those to work as they're intended, you have to broadcast those. And so with the herbicides that can cause damage to ornamentals, you're getting a lot of that into the root zone of those ornamental plants. So that's another potential issue with some of those. Commercially available products, so you can buy, professional grade stuff as long as it's not restricted use on online resources and things like that. You can buy those, but the downsides are that the high prices, you typically have to buy large quantities, and you need to be very, very careful with these professional products just because they're going to be at much higher concentration. So an example of that, MSM, herbicide called MSM or metsulfuron, 1 ounce, 30 grams treats an acre. So if you're treating 1,000 square feet, that's 0.7 grams, very small quantity. If you go out, much higher rate, you can cause a lot of damage with these. So that's just another word of caution. Make sure that you're calibrated and that you know how to use the equipment that they're using, whether that's a sprayer or a granular spreader. And then AI suggests herbicides. You can use those as tool, but always verify those with other sources. If you put it into Chat GPT and things, it can give you good results in some cases on a lot of topics. But use those with caution and verify it, because the AIs are only as good as the information that are fed into those. And with a lot of things, they're still learning and getting information fed into them. And so you can put in information that can give you bad recommendations in some cases, especially on kind of niche topics like, what's going to control this weed. And it might give you a herbicide that will work, but not in your specific situation. Always use non-chemical methods like I talked about. Make sure that the cultural conditions and stuff are on point, and using all those proper cultural practices and things, because that's going to give you the best results and set you up for success. And then also just keep in mind that not all weeds have to be removed. Just because a weed is there does not mean that it's an evil plant or anything. If you are growing that there because you like that it's attracting pollinators, or it's just providing green, where the grass isn't growing because it's too shady or too dry or whatever, it doesn't mean that just because it's considered quote unquote a weed species, or it's referred to as a weed species, that it's a weed. There are a lot of the weeds that we think of as typical weeds or native plants, and they can provide benefits, and they can be, just fine if you can tolerate them. So just always keep that in mind as well. And then with that, I will answer any questions. Hopefully I have time to answer some questions, but thank you for your time and for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Dr. Marble, for that presentation. We definitely have a lot of questions, so we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can with the time we have left. But if your question does not get answered, please email Dr. Marble and we will get that answered for you. So we have a lot of questions about people concerned with using herbicides around wildlife and their butterflies and bees with their gardens, and also just around dogs and people as well. So do you have any advice for that situation?
So while the labels aren't going to give you, real specifics on, especially different types of pollinators and things like that, the best thing to do will be to use those at times when the pollinators aren't out. So you can time that, later in the day or whenever the pollinators aren't out there. For animals and pets and things, it'll typically say to keep those off of those areas until the spray is dry, but the specific herbicide will give you instructions on how to do that.
And someone else was interested in learning more about how glyphosate, if it's safe in their landscape, and how many times are they able to reapply it without damaging soil?
So there, as far as it's safe in the landscape, so Yeah, there's a lot of controversy and everything around that, and I definitely don't have time to get into all that. I'll say that, if you're using it according to the label that it's if you're using it correctly and how it's intended to be used, it shouldn't cause any major issues and things if you're not applying it to the plants that you don't want to apply it to. If somebody doesn't want to use glyphosate, there's definitely other options than that. And in terms of how many times you can actually use it without causing damage to the soil. There's going to be, with herbicides, there's going to be an annual use limit on all those, and it's going to give you, say, you can't apply more than such and such amount of active ingredient or total amount of product per acre per year or whatever, or per 1,000 square feet per year. And so you need to always stay within those annual limitations on those labels.
Kind of going off of that question as well, can you talk a little bit about herbicide resistance? Does that issue occur in homeowner landscapes?
Sure, yeah. So I don't think it's actually occurring. Like, I don't think homeowners are really are causing a lot of resistance issues. It definitely could happen, but you're definitely going to encounter weeds that are resistant to herbicides that are coming in from cropping systems or whatever else. Resistance is occurring, all the time. We have a lot of weed species that develop resistance to multiple different modes of actions of herbicides. But you definitely want to, not just for resistance management, but you want to rotate and use different herbicides just for things like environmental issues, using different things and not using the same product over and over again is going to be beneficial environmentally, then also in terms of preventing resistance development. But when you have those issues, especially in the homeowner landscape, an advantage that we have is that it's typically a smaller area, and no weed has ever developed resistance to being dug up and put in, chopped up with the hoe and thrown into the garbage. So it's not going to develop resistance to that. So you can always use, physical controls and stuff, at least on small areas in a lot of cases. So.
Can you talk a little bit about safety measures when using homeowner herbicides? Someone was talking about how you mentioned the safety in relation to plants, but they also were asking about the safety of using the chemicals.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So just about the minimum that you're going to have to use when using any herbicide is long sleeve shirt, long pants, shoes plus socks, and chemical resistant gloves. A lot of cases you also need to wear eye protection, but people don't look at the safety information. You're going to have a PPE section on the label that's going to say personal protective equipment. It's going to say what you have to wear. And I'd say, that's the bare minimum on just about all these different products. For homeowners, that's really going to be probably the maximum. If you have to wear more than that, it's not going to be labeled for the homeowner segment. I'd say especially for the organic contact options that are out there, really look at those, because those are ones that they're very caustic to the eyes and to the skin. And so those are ones where you have to be very careful in terms of the PPE, and those typically will require eye protection, but the labels will tell you what all you need to wear. So.
Someone else had a question about using vinegar and other methods such as soap or other organic herbicide methods. Do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, so there's if you want to use like organic methods, there's definitely organic herbicides that are out there and available, and those are going to be more effective and a lot cheaper than just using uh, you know um, uh, uh, vinegar out of the cabinet. It's going to be a higher concentration of acetic acid, and it's going to be mixed at a ratio that's going to be effective for weed control. I don't recommend people using homeowner concoctions. People will do it and it will burn weeds and things, but typically, you're going to get a lot better results by using the actual pesticide that's labeled, and it tells you the proper PPE to wear and the proper rates to use it and instructions and everything, as opposed to just going willy-nilly out of something on the out of the kitchen cabinet. Also, it's going to be a lot cheaper as well, a lot less expensive. People will talk about mixing these different things and how much cheaper it is. But if you actually go through and do the calculations, a gallon of that versus a gallon of something that's actually labeled for a herbicide, the actual herbicide that's intended to market and used as a herbicide and doesn't have to be food grade is going to be a fraction of what you're actually using out of the kitchen. So.
Do you have any advice on the best type of herbicides specifically to be using around children and dogs for safety?
Um, as far as the type of herbicide, I mean, it really depends upon, there's not really a herbicide that is going to be, that I'm going to say is always safe to use in any situation, because it just depends upon who's applying it and the rate that it's used and all those different things. There's not going to be one, like if you have things that you're concerned about like that, you still always also have to take into account what you're actually using the herbicide for. So is it actually going to even solve the problem that you have? Because if it isn't, then it's not even worth using, and I wouldn't even recommend using a herbicide in that case. So that's a kind of a, I mean, it's a great question, and but it's just kind of a loaded question where there's a lot of other information that I would have to answer that effectively.
I have a lot of people who are asking about torpedo grass and what the best control method for that is.
Torpedo grass is tough, and that's one of those where I say, if you have torpedo grass or coven grass in your landscape, you need a real estate agent and not a weed scientist. Sell the property before people know that it's there, and then be done with it. But no, and seriously, it's a tough weed to control. Glyphosate is an effective option on torpedo grass if you can spot treat where you're not harming other plants. That's, as far as the products that are labeled for use in the landscape, that's probably the most effective on torpedo grass. There's also things like I talked about, the fluazafop, which is labeled as a grass killer. That can be used, and that can be applied over the top of a lot of broadleaf plants. So if you had torpedo grass in, say, a planting bed, that's probably going to be your best option. You're not going to control torpedo grass with one application of anything. It's going to be a process. It's going to be probably a combination of physical removal and then also herbicides. But those grass killer products that are selected for grasses, that might be something to where you can apply it over the top of certain broadleaf plants and non-grass species, and at least slow down that torpedo grass until you can control. But it's going to be one that's going to take a lot of time and effort to remove it when it's actually there. When it's in turf grass, it's a much more difficult challenge.
I have someone who's interested in learning about what the best type of herbicide to use on the soil for when they're planning on planting a vegetable garden and how long they should wait until planting that.
I'll tell you what I like for vegetable gardens, and I've had the best success with this. And I'm a fan of herbicides, but solarization. So, if you depend upon when you're wanting to plant your garden, say it's a fall garden or something, but covering that area that you're going to plant with plastic, letting that heat up, and for a few weeks, getting that soil really hot, and that's going to take care of a lot of your weed issues, and then also things like certain pathogens and insect issues and things. But I think that's great for vegetable gardens and things. You don't have to worry about herbicides hanging around in something that you're going to eat. And then also another thing for vegetable gardens, it's also, I mean, I didn't talk a lot about mulch, but I'm a big proponent of mulch in the landscape. And that's another great option that's non-chemical for use around things that you're going to eat in the landscape as well. Mulch is very effective on a lot of the weed species that you're dealing with. So those are two things that I would look at.
And I have someone asking, so they said to clarify, if you want to permanently kill a plant, a contact herbicide won't work. You need a systemic herbicide that translocates. And they're wondering what is a good contact herbicide.
So you can kill small weeds with contacts, like small annual weeds. A contact will work fine because you don't have to get translocation to the root, especially annuals. They typically don't have deep root systems and things. But it depends, like well, the question was, what's a good contact herbicide? Yeah,
Yes.
so it depends on what weed you're targeting, but there's not a whole lot of difference in all of them. But the rates that you have to use and the uh, the number of applications that it might take, and all those things will differ a lot. But the ones that you're going to have available to you are like the ones that I listed. The organic products, the things that are like citrus oil, oregano oil, acetic acid, and then diquat and pelargonic acid. You'll see those labeled for or used for in homeowner segments. You usually don't get those by themselves though. They're typically going to be as a component of something else. But those natural weed killers, those are typically sold as sole components, and so that might be more aligned with what you're looking for.
In your presentation, you talked about a soil sterilant. Could you define that?
Yeah, so it's just kind of now I think that's not really a scientific term, but soil sterilant, I'm just saying that basically, so like with those herbicides that I talked about, um, the mazethapure and imazapure. So you apply those. It's gonna have post-emergent activity on the things that are there, and then weeds that start to grow there or roots that go into those areas. Those herbicides are going to affect those. They're xylem mobile, meaning they can be absorbed from the roots of the plants, and they can translocate up and cause that injury, like I showed you in those pictures. So that's very useful and helpful in some situations, but those don't have any place in like a planting bed, for example. They're not killing everything in the soil, but for plants that are there that are sensitive to those, they're going to cause a lot of injury to those, but they're not labeled. They were never intended to be used in those situations. Though the reason I pointed that out is because that's a great case where people didn't follow label directions and had bad results.
Another term that you used in your presentation was ALS. Could you also define that one for us?
Yeah, that's acetyl lactate synthase inhibitor. That's just the mode of action of that particular herbicide. So it's the
Okay.
part of the plant that herbicide is actually affecting.
We had some people that were interested in triclopyr. Could you talk a little bit about that and how someone was wondering if it would kill the whole tree if they're just treating some offshoots from the roots?
No, so yeah, I mean, I wouldn't recommend, like, if you had like suckers that you're trying to control, and it depends upon the plant. So like a sucker of a crepe myrtle is going to be a lot more sensitive than a sucker on a 100-year-old oak tree, for example. But yeah, you can. I mean, you can even with those other herbicides, like they could be spot treated around, and you might not see any issues. But it's just not something that you want to use like you would some other herbicide. If it's a vine killer, it's triclopyr. Look at where it's actually labeled for use, depending upon the concentration too, because those concentrations can vary widely in those different things. Yeah, you could spot treat weeds and things, but if it's labeled for use as a vine killer and things, it's going to give you directions for how to use that and where it can be used. So, but yeah, it's just a broadleaf herbicide. It's very translocated. It's very effective on large things and vines and stuff like that. But yeah, if you're just spot treating little suckers and things, you're not going to kill large trees and things. But it's not something to be none of these herbicides or anything to be careless with.
And another question that we have was, what is the best herbicide to use on plants that have escaped the area that you have them in, such as perennial peanut or Asiatic jasmine?
So I would say if you can't use like keeping them in the area for Asiatic jasmine, especially because perennial peanut, depending upon the cultivar that it is, it might be spreading from rhizomes, so that's a little bit more difficult. Asiatic jasmine isn't going to really do that. You just have the shoots running, but keeping that area like your Asiatic jasmine beds, keeping them edged with an edger, will keep it from running. But yeah, if it's escaped. You'd want to use like it depends on what they escaped into also. Are they escaping into turf grass that you want to save, or are they escaping into a planting bed? But typically when you have something that you kind of want to, you're trying to use a herbicide to be kind of a pruning tool, basically, it will be the contacts. You wouldn't want something that's systemic. You don't want to treat, an offshoot and have it move and cause damage to the plants where they're actually at. But it really depends upon what they escaped into and the whole situation. So.
Thank you so much. And that's about all the time that we have for questions. But like I said, if I didn't get to your question, I did put Dr. Marble's email in the chat. So please follow up with him. And I want to thank everyone so much for joining us to our webinar. And our next webinar will be on April 15th. So be sure to tune in then. Thank you guys.
Thanks.